imagine them. And nor for the moment can the Institute of Education, and I'll say more about that later, because we're standing in the middle of a spectrum of possibilities. But if you take an example from management or leadership or, let's say, social science broadly, you can imagine that someone might be interested in the dynamics of social networks or engagements, and let's say its implications for learning. Let's take a topic like that. How do you possibly capture, other than in some form of diagrammatic, abstracted way, social network theory or the actualities of engagement? That's the problem, and I think that's where students are beginning to push at words. I do believe in words, actually. I've grown up with them, so it's sort of curious that I'm interested in the non-verbal fields, but it helps sharpen for me the affordances, that is, what each of these modes can do, what each of these modes allow you to do. And just to answer the question, well, is it possible to argue without words? Well, it is. The photo essay is a long, tried and tested form in photojournalism. That is a series or sequence of photographs. That's called an essay. It doesn't use words. So if you're researching multimodal communication or digitized practices, are conventional methodologies and methods adequate? I think what we often do, what often takes place, I've seen it in a number of theses I've examined or supervised, is that the student captures traces of the activity, not the activity itself. It's sort of an abstracted trace of the activity. So one has to ask, is that good enough? If we're really pushing forward research, is what I'll say later on this slide, some residual attack on the problem, is that good enough? To capture the complexity of activity, other methods may need to be employed, like video data recording and analysis, not easy in its own right, sound recording and archiving, transcription, which itself is an act of transduction from one mode to another. Transcription is taking speech and moving it into another mode with all the sort of losses and gains you get from doing that. Does conventional capturing of activity in written language, despite its advantages in abstraction and categorization, etc., simply look too ponderous, too after the event, too ex post facto? I think that's the question we've got to ask. Is the most research that is undertaken after the event, after something has happened, right? Catching its coattails, as it were, and looking for patterns in the traces or entrails of the problem rather than grappling with the problem itself. And finally, are we too seduced by the illusion of a causal relationship between phenomena? And there's a wonderful phrase, because my background's in English language and literature and so on, I came across a phrase that meant a lot to me once, is in Latin, post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this. So narrative sequence sort of suggests that, in a novel, for example, what happens after some other event happens because of that event. But that's a very strong notion in certainly European scientific thinking, that causality is something we're trying to get at in a thesis, and many, many students feel, I think, hung up by that, even though it is an important part of their work. In order to show you some of the thinking that took place in the seminar series and before that, actually, in a previous series, I want to just take you through some thinking I did a few years ago in trying to understand, particularly for methodological purposes, how causality wasn't quite enough to cope with the sort of problems I was interested in. And I began this particular sequence I'm going to show you in trying to think about the relationships between, on this side, let's call it X, new technologies and new technological development in ICT, information and communication technology. And on the other side, I started thinking about literacy development, but it soon got kind of broadened into thinking about learning in general. So this model, X affects or has an impact on Y, is a classic sort of causal design. And you can design experiments to test that. particularly randomized controlled trials and other experimental studies, are aiming to try and define that particular relationship. But this model assumes a sort of reciprocity between X and Y, if you like, a dialogic relationship between those two phenomena. In other words, although X may affect Y, it may also be the case that Y affects X, perhaps to the same degree, perhaps to a lesser extent, or even possibly to a greater extent. In my own field, in the mid-90s, there was a wonderful book that really was based around this notion of a two-way sort of relationship between phenomena, not just one way, which was called Studies in the Materiality of Literacy by Christine Haas. And what she said was that that relationship between new technologies and, in her case, literacy development was actually not causal, it was symbiotic. Now, I took so I thought, oh, this is interesting. You know, this complicates research, actually, if we're having to look at symbiotic relationships between phenomena. It could be any two phenomena, that's why I put them in algebraic terms. But, so I went to the biology department of the university I was working in at the time, and I said, someone in my field has described the relationship I'm interested in between new technologies and learning as symbiotic, and you're a biologist, can you tell me more about symbiosis? She said, what you're describing is not symbiosis, because symbiosis is a conservative relationship. Each party in a symbiotic relationship aims to keep things the way they are, and they have a kind of happy marriage, as it were. But it's static. It doesn't sort of move or develop. Whereas, she said, in the fields you're looking at, learning theory and development in new technologies, there is development. So she helped me to see that both ICT and learning change in time. What counts for ICT in 1990 is different by the year 2000, and again, different in 2011. I'm going to a conference in Oxford in September called A Decade in Internet Time, looking at what's happened from 2001 to now in terms of impact on learning. And if you go back to 1990, well, that was really the birth of the internet, and in the early 90s, its application in education. So she said, it's not symbiotic. We have a term in biology for what you're describing, she said, which is reciprocal coevolution. These two phenomena go alongside each other, and they are related to each other. Not only at stage 2, as it were, is there a new relationship, but there are residual relationships. Learning theory at a certain stage may well draw on older practices of the application of new technologies, and I know that personally to my own cost. I'm always trying to catch up on this plane, so I'm using sort of older ways of managing and shaping knowledge, but trying to push forward, if you like, on the let's call it the substantial side, and so on. Just to speed this up a bit, it goes on, and there are sort of residual relationships, particularly of people on that side catching up and drawing on previous configurations of technology, but also it works the other way too, in that software designers, technology developers sometimes draw on older models of learning in order to kind of shape and define what they're doing. I think a very nice concrete example of this is the development of Word as a software program over the last 20 years and the way it's coped with drafting and editing. You know, so it's gone hand in hand with understandings of the writing process, and sometimes the technological side is in the advance, and sometimes the actual learning practices are in the advance. So as I thought about this, I thought, well, that's a long way on from simple causality when looking at two different kinds of phenomena. Absolutely fine to still work on a simple causal model, but let's see it within a larger picture, where phenomena relate in much more complex ways to each other than simply causal ways. So I just added some contextual words, as it were, another mode, to the